Hello everybody, and welcome to another Pants Shadow Priest guide. Today we're talking about snapshotting. I'll describe what snapshotting is, why we do it, when it's worth doing, and how you can use it to improve your play. If you like this content, please consider liking and subscribing, as that will allow me to keep making content similar to this. There are a few pieces to this video, so feel free to hop around using the timestamps in the description below. Without further ado, let's hop into snapshotting. What is snapshotting? Snapshotting refers to any buffs on your character that you're applying to your spells. These spells will deal damage for a longer period of time than the buff lasts on your character. This means that even when the buff fades from our character, it will still be applied to the spell that we just casted. Note that I'm emphasizing buffs that are on your character. Any debuffs on the target are immediately applied to any spells that you have on that target. So these would include Mimiron in Phase 3, when the head gets pulled down and starts taking 50% increased damage. Any dots you have on Mimiron before the head gets pulled down will automatically start dealing 50% more damage as the head is brought to the ground. This also includes the Singe debuff on Hodier that causes him to take 50% more magic damage. You don't need to recast your dots to take advantage of this buff, as any dots on Hodier will automatically have their damage increased. When we refer to snapshotting, we're primarily talking about our damage over time spells, aka dots, but you can also snapshot buffs onto Flay and Sear, and I'll talk about those at the end of the video. First up, let's talk about Shadowward Pain. When snapshotting and Shadow Priests are talked about together, it's almost entirely about Shadowward Pain. This is due to the Pain and Suffering talent, which allows Flay to refresh the duration of Shadowward Pain. This means that one cast of Shadowward Pain can last on a single target for an entire fight. So the first cast is extremely important, as we want as many buffs applied as possible so that they can remain on the target until it dies. Now, what types of buffs can be snapshotted onto Shadowward Pain? Because not all of them can be. There are two primary kinds of buffs. First is critical chance modifiers, and second is percent damage modifiers. A critical chance modifier is something like the crit bonus on a potion of wild magic. This is the reason that Shadow Priests pre-potion with Potion of Wild Magic. The critical chance of the potion remains on the Shadowward Pain even after the buff fades away and lasts for the entire fight. Similarly, percent damage buffs also remain. This type of buff is something you would find from the rogue spell Tricks of the Trade, as well as the Shadow Priest talent Shadow Weaving that gives 10% shadow damage at 5 stacks. This is why in the opening rotation for Shadow Priest, we wait until we have 5 stacks of Shadow Weaving to cast Shadowward Pain, because we want that percent damage modifier to remain on Shadowward Pain for the entire fight. If you cast Shadowward Pain when you only have 4 stacks of Shadow Weaving, then even after you get your 5th stack, if you refresh Shadowward Pain with Flay, it'll act as if it has 4 stacks of the buff, which means you're missing out on 2% damage for the entire fight. I have a video on the Shadow Priest rotation, so if you want to learn more about that in detail, then go check out that video. So those are the only kinds of buffs that can snapshot onto Shadowward Pain. The values for any other buff will be refreshed every time that Flay is used to refresh Shadowward Pain, while only the original values of the snapshotted buffs will be used. So what if you get a strong percent damage buff in the middle of a fight, like Thaddeus? Since that is a percent damage increase, you have to recast Shadowward Pain in order to get the effect of the buff. Refreshing with Flay will not give you the effect of the damage increase until you recast Shadowward Pain. After you recast it, then every time you refresh with Flay, that buff will stay on Thaddeus forever. Now that we talked about what buffs do snapshot, what buffs don't snapshot with Shadowward Pain? Spell power will update every time you deal damage with Flay, as well as any buffs that don't affect critical chance and aren't percent damage buffs, such as the lightning buff on Hodier. This buff increases the damage of critical strikes, not the percent chance of critical strikes. Since these buffs don't snapshot, they get checked for by the game every time you cast Flay. If they are on your character when you cast Flay, then it's going to be applied to Shadowward Pain. But the second that it falls off and you then refresh Shadowward Pain with Flay, those buffs will be gone from Shadowward Pain. This also means that it's impossible to snapshot a spell power trinket, for example. If you have Dying Curse and it procs and you get that juicy 765 spell power, it's only going to last for the duration of the buff, as once you cast Flay after that, that damage is going to be removed from Shadowward Pain. Now that we've laid out what kind of buffs can be snapshotted, let's look at an example of snapshotting on a target dummy. On the left dummy, I'm going to cast Shadow Word Pain with 0 stacks of Shadow Weaving. And on the right target, I'm going to cast Shadow Word Pain with 5 stacks of Shadow Weaving. Then I'm going to refresh both while having 5 stacks of Shadow Weaving. Note that the damage on the left dummy does not increase after being refreshed. It doesn't change from 0 stacks of Shadow Weaving to 5. That's because I snapshotted that Shadow Word Pain with 0 stacks of Shadow Weaving. So even though I refreshed while having 5 stacks, it doesn't apply to the target. I need to recast Shadow Word Pain in order to get the 5 stacks of Shadow Weaving onto the left dummy. Similarly, the right dummy does not lose damage, even though I refresh Shadow Word Pain after my Shadow Weaving stacks have fallen off. So when it comes to snapshotting, Shadow Weaving is the main buff that we're going to want to track. If you have a rogue, you can try to get Tricks of the Trade on the pull so you can apply it to your first Shadow Word Pain, although that is better used on Affliction Warlocks with Corruption. Now that we've seen the difference in casting Shadow Word Pain with and without 5 stacks of Shadow Weaving, is it always worth waiting for 5 stacks of Shadow Weaving to cast Shadow Word Pain? So the answer is, it depends. On any encounter that lasts over a minute, where you can continually attack the boss because there's no intermission, it is absolutely worth snapshotting at 5 stacks of Shadow Weaving. You want to get as much damage as possible into your Shadow Word Pain because it's going to last for a long enough time that the increased damage on each tick outweigh trying to get an extra tick of Shadow Word Pain. The reason that you would not want to snapshot Shadow Word Pain is that you can cast it earlier in your rotation. This will allow you to get an extra tick or 2 of Shadow Word Pain. And on really short fights, that extra tick is going to outweigh the damage that you would get from increasing the damage of each tick through Shadow Weaving. So on short fights that aren't going to last a minute, or if you're running through a dungeon and you're fighting some small mobs that aren't going to live very long, you don't want to worry about getting 5 stacks of Shadow Weaving. In these types of encounters, you just want to put up your dots as soon as you can, and then start mind searing or single targeting an enemy down. It's better to cast Shadow Word Pain early to get an extra tick than to worry about the Shadow Weaving stacks in these circumstances. As you pay attention to the lengths of fights more, you'll really start to understand when it is worth it to snapshot Shadow Word Pain. Ultimately, Shadow Word Pain does not deal a lot of damage though, so if you don't snapshot correctly, it's not going to hurt your parse that much. It's definitely something that top Shadow Priests are maximizing, but if you're just starting out, then don't stress about it. You're not going to lose too much damage if you don't snapshot correctly. If anything, it's worse to cast Shadow Word Pain multiple times throughout the fight than it is to snapshot it incorrectly. This is because you're wasting time on that cast when you could be casting another spell that's going to deal a lot more damage than that extra 2, 4, or 6% that you're going to be getting from your Shadow Word Pain. Next up, let's talk about Vampiric Touch and Devouring Plague. These spells behave in the exact same way, so I'm going to talk about them together. When you cast either of these spells, every buff on your character lasts for the entire duration of the dot, even if the buff expires before the dot is finished dealing damage. Unlike Shadow Word Pain, these dots do not last forever, and they must be casted again in order to take advantage of any new buffs on your character. For the most part, you'll just cast these spells to maintain their uptime on your targets, and you're not going to worry about the buffs on your character. There is one exception to that, and that's with Devouring Plague. In our opener on a boss encounter, Devouring Plague will be our second cast, and this will generally be cast before Bloodlust. Once Bloodlust has been casted for your raid, we want to recast Devouring Plague to take advantage of the haste buff. Due to how long Devouring Plague lasts, it's more DPS to recast it with Lust than to wait for the initial debuff to fall off the target to reapply it. You do not recast Vampiric Touch in this circumstance, only Devouring Plague. If you're doing a fight where Bloodlust isn't cast until later in the fight, then don't worry about recasting it in your opener, as it's only ever done with Bloodlust. Now I'm going to experiment with Vampiric Touch on a target dummy, just to show how buffs work, and that the buffs will last on Vampiric Touch even after they fall off your character. Devouring Plague behaves the same way, so you can apply this to Devouring Plague as well. On the first target, I'm going to cast a regular Vampiric Touch. I then activate a Spell Power Trinket and cast Vampiric Touch on the second target. I cancel this buff from the trinket, and you can see that the damage is still higher on the second target. This is because the dot that I casted there maintains the buff for its entire duration, even though the buff is no longer on my character. This is the same way all dots behave when hard casted, but Shadow Word Pain behaves differently because it gets refreshed through pain and suffering. If I were to cast another Vampiric Touch onto this target, it would overwrite the current spell and start dealing less damage than it was dealing before because I no longer have the buff on my character. And that's really it for Vampiric Touch and Devouring Plague. This is really just a demonstration so that you could understand how buffs affect these spells. This brings us to our final point with Mind Flay and Mind Sear. Mind Flay and Mind Sear behave very similarly to Vampiric Touch and Devouring Plague. As soon as you start the channel, it'll take into account the buffs that are on your character. If those buffs fall off while you're casting, your cast will maintain the same damage and haste and crit that it had when you first casted it. So any buffs that were on your character when you first started channeling a Mind Flay or Mind Sear are maintained throughout the entire duration of the channel. This doesn't have many practical uses for Mind Flay, considering how short the cast is, but can increase your damage with Mind Sear by a lot if done correctly. I'm going to show some examples from previous raids that I've done where I try to snapshot buffs right as they're falling off onto my Mind Sear to maximize my AoE damage. In order to effectively take advantage of this, you're going to want to have a cast bar that shows you ticks of channeled spells. This can be done with Quartz, Gnosis, or Weakauras. The reason is because you're going to want to cancel a cast in the middle of it right after a tick occurs so that you can start casting Mind Sear again just as your buff is about to fall off. This is really important with powerful trinket procs because they don't last that long. So if you can get basically a full cast of Mind Sear that is benefiting from one of your trinkets, even when the trinket had 1 second left in its duration, it's going to greatly increase the amount of damage you do with that Mind Sear. In this clip, I've activated the on-use effect of the trinket Scales of Face. This gives you a nice haste buff. I'm casting Mind Sear, and you can see as the buff has 1 second left, I recast Mind Sear. What this allows me to do is benefit from the haste for that entire cast. You can see the cast time remains at 3.5 seconds, and the new cast time for the next channel is 3.9 seconds. 0.4 seconds might not sound like a lot, but when you're racing to do damage against everybody in your raid, it can add up, especially if you pair it with a strong trinket proc such as Flare of the Heavens or Dying Curse. Again, there's not too many practical applications, especially in boss fights for this, but it's worth knowing about in case the opportunity ever arises to take advantage of this. And that's all I have for you today on snapshotting. If you're just starting to snapshot your dots, then I highly suggest practicing on a target dummy like I did in the video. Remember, it's going to hurt your DPS more if you recast Shadow Word Pain over and over again trying to snapshot correctly than if you mess up your first snapshot and only cast Shadow Word Pain once. If you like this content, then let me know in the comments below and tell me what kind of video you'd like to see next. Feel free to reach out on Discord or check out my Twitch if you have any Shadow Priest questions. That's all from me, and I'll see you in the next one.